are things that St. Thomas describes that are beyond immaterial, they're also material, right? It is paramount that the lower faculties, those that again operate through a bodily organ, serve the higher faculties or subordinate to the higher faculties. How can you do that in modern psychology and assist someone in doing that if you don't even recognize the soul to begin with? Basically, you don't even recognize the higher faculties, right? So at best, you're helping clean up some of the mess in the lower faculties, like your emotions getting out of whack and your memories that are constantly tripping you up and your imagination that is going every which way. At best, you might help kind of buffer, the trigger, so to speak, or the environmental motivators. At worst, you're just solidifying the need that the lower faculties are in charge.
Hey, my name is Matt Poole, and this is Unapologetically Catholic, the show where we talk about the different reasons why I personally am unapologetically Catholic and why I think that you should be too. This week we have Keoni with Serviam Institute. He is the second ever virtual interview guest that I've had on the show, and I think it was a great episode. We talk about psychology, Thomistic psychology, the difference between the two, what virtue and vice is, and how to combat vice, all kinds of really good topics. So I think you'll really enjoy this episode. If you've not already, please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel and sharing around with your friends, leaving a like and a comment, all of those things that help get this to more people that it might be beneficial for. But with all of that, let's get right into it.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Keoni. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also a certified high performance coach, and I'm the CEO and founder of Serviam Institute, which offers coaching services for those looking to grow in virtue. It is grounded in Thomistic psychology, which is a huge passion of mine. I'm sure we'll get into what Thomistic psychology is, so I don't want to spoil it, at least too soon. But yeah, really what I do is I offer authentic Catholic counseling and coaching services for those that are really hungry to grow, but don't want to do it in the way that's, the modern psychological way. We're doing it different. We're doing it authentically Catholic. And I'm excited to share more about what that means with you today.
Yeah. So that's one of the things when you originally had reached out, and I liked in your intro email, you used the unapologetically Catholic little tagline there, or phrase, whatever you want to call it. But I think that's really important because like all areas of our life can really build on the faith. Sometimes you'll get like where people try to compartmentalize and go, well, I go to mass on Sunday, and then maybe I pray a rosary once a week or something like that. But then, all this other like work that doesn't have anything to do with my faith, and being a parent that really doesn't have anything to do with my faith, but it does. And I think that's really great that you're doing this kind of work, saying, hey, no, this, how you are as a person, how you tick, the things that you may be going through, the struggles you may be having, all of these things can be integrated with your faith, and they should be. So, yeah. Yep. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's such a travesty when it's not integrated, right? Because we weren't made to be like, well, this is my box here, and this is my box here, and then I turn to this group of people for this issue. And I think there's some areas where, it could be prudent to say this person's an expert in this area, or someone who's at least within my vicinity, so I talk to them, even though you may not talk to them about another topic. And I think there's some good in that, but really, like what you said about work, family life, marriage, hobbies, your own mental health, if they're not integrated with your faith, I think at best it's a disservice. At worst, it's actually making you maybe even more disintegrated, or maybe even harming your progress, right? So it's in our best interest, especially doing something as intimate as what you might call personal development or mental health or coaching, whatever term you want to use. I just think of it as cultivation of virtue, right? If it's not integrated with our faith, which is ultimately, it illumines the whole goal of life, right, is to be one with our Lord for all eternity. If you're missing that as a foundation, I mean, it can be pretty harmful, or you can waste a lot of your time, which is
Yeah.
not what I want to do with the people I work with, right? I want it to be like, no, no, this is intimately connected to you living your vocation in union with your faith as excellently as possible, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's really good. Well, briefly, so if
Yeah.
people are kind of like, man, I like already, where do I go to find you? Where's a couple of places they because I think
Yes,
this is all
yes.
really
So
good.
definitely. So the website is serviuminstitute.com. Servium is I will serve in Latin. And the
Okay.
inspiration behind Servium was the opposite response that Satan gave to our Lord, which was non servium in the beginning, right? And Servium is often attributed to Saint Michael as his response, in response to Satan's response, where he said, I will serve you. Um, that really resonated with me, is this idea of here I am, pursuing. I was a college student at the time at Franciscan University, and I was trying to create a conference. That was a part of my leadership final senior year project, is you have to create a conference. So I created a men's conference, and it was titled Servium. And at that point, it was like, I want men who want to serve. And little did I know, what would that be? Six or so years later, I started Servium Institute, which was my now passion in a reality of service through what I love. That is coaching, counseling from a Thomistic perspective. So they can find me at serviuminstitute.com. You can also find me on Instagram, The Virtue Coach, and you can email me, Keoni at serviuminstitute.com as well.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, we'll
Yeah,
I'll make sure I put all that stuff in the description
perfect.
so that people can find it easy because I know that's hard to it's hard to remember like, oh wait, hold on one second. It's
Yeah,
easier
yeah,
to
yeah,
just have it,
definitely.
click it and go. Um
Exactly, exactly.
well, so I did want to ask you too because I know you've mentioned it a couple of times and I like there's a lot of times where you'll hear it seems like gym bros, like Catholic gym bros, not knocking on
Yeah.
them, but it seems like those guys are always the kind of guys who are like, let's grow in virtue. Come on, let's get fit and like grow in virtue. Come bulk up and get grow in virtue. And so you hear
Right.
like this call of grow in virtue, but what even I mean, I think that's a good question to ask. What even is virtue and why in the world would I want to grow in that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think we as Catholics, we've all heard it in some way, shape, or form, and we know it's good, right? Like that virtue thing is pretty
Yeah.
good. But most of us can't really articulate it. Like, what is it? Like your question asks, and two, how does it relate to me? Like, what do I do with that? Right. So, virtue, simply speaking, is basically a firm disposition to do what is good, right? By firm disposition, that's why we often call it like a habit, which is another
Mm,
firm disposition. It's something that doesn't waver. It's not an on and off thing, right? It's a little bit more long lasting, pervasive in your day in and day out life, right?
mm,
So a virtue is a rightly ordered firm disposition, where a vice would be a disordered firm disposition, right? It's a consistent habit towards what is evil, or what St. Thomas would say is a privation of a good, a lack of good, right? There's an
mm,
absence of good in that decision or action that you take, right? So in the cultivation of virtue, what you're doing is you're building rightly ordered habits. Now, where a lot of people fail to understand virtue in light of our mental health, in light of our healing and integration, St. Thomas actually um, integrates virtue specifically with our nature, meaning there are four cardinal virtues, right? A lot of the gym bros, what they talk about is the virtue of fortitude, which is essentially courage, right? So when you go to the gym and you do that hard thing and you grind and you push yourself beyond maybe what you think you're capable of, there's that natural courage that you build, right? But there's cardinal virtues. There's four of these.
mm,
So prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Prudence is essentially making wise decisions, knowing what to do and when to do it to achieve the goal, right? Justice is rendering another his due, right? It's about duty. It's about a sense of order, right? Fortitude is, as I said, it's courage. It's essentially a willingness to do difficult things, okay? And then temperance is the last one, which is basically moderation of your sensual pleasures. right? Basically keeping your desires and pleasures and senses kind of at bay, not letting them kind of take over, right? The beautiful thing that St. Thomas tells us is that each of those cardinal virtues perfects one of your faculties. Prudence perfects your intellect. Justice perfects your will, right? So that your will is actually ordered towards what is good. You choose what is due to you, to myself, right? And to ultimately our Lord, right? Fortitude perfects your irascible appetite, which we can just call your motivation, your drive. And then temperance perfects what Aquinas calls your concupiscible appetite, which we can call your basic desires, right? What it is that you are inclined towards, what you think is good. For you, that might be chocolate. For me, that might be cheeseburgers. Either way, it's a simple good, right? I need to be
Yeah.
able to moderate that. And temperance is the virtue that moderates those desires. It keeps that faculty in check from kind of going haywire, right? Because as you know, right, those gym bros, they can overdo it. They can say, you know what, throw in, 245s. I got this, even though that's a little too much given how you've been building the past couple weeks, right? But
Yeah.
the music, they're playing that right song, and the bros are encouraging me in just the right way. And what happens? You hurt yourself.
Yeah.
Why? Because you were focusing on doing the courageous thing, but you lacked prudence in
Mm.
understanding this wasn't the next right good to pursue. It's a good thing to push yourself, and maybe even eventually you would put two extra plates. But right now, that was imprudent because you didn't really understand the circumstances, and your hunger for greatness got the best of you, and it was
Mm.
really ambition and or pride that got you. And so it's insufficient to just say grow in fortitude. Lifting gives you courage, which I agree, but that's such a small piece of it. And that's what I really want when it comes to virtue. I really want people to understand it's so much bigger than that. And we haven't even talked about natural versus supernatural virtue and the intellectual virtues and the theological virtues. That's probably maybe another conversation. But I think most of us, what you're seeing on social media, what most of us talk about are usually the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. We hear that a lot. You say it in your rosary, right? And then the natural virtues, which you're seeing become popularized a lot right now in kind of the Catholic influencer
Mm-hmm.
culture, mainly courage. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. That I think that was really good because and it's not to like poke at all these guys who are saying, "Oh, grow in virtue," but because I think it's like you said, it's a good thing. We should be
Oh,
growing in these
definitely.
different virtues,
Absolutely.
but you gotta like you can't have one without the other. I mean, it's the same with our faith now, right? Like you can't say, oh, "I'll just go to mass on Sunday and receive the Eucharist," but like I'm never gonna pray unless I'm at mass. Like that's the only time. Like you're
Yeah.
not gonna grow if you do that, and if you do that, you
Mm-hmm.
you could get off kilter, or even flip it on the other way around. I'm gonna pray all the time, but I don't really need to go to mass. It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
it's good that you're praying, but you're missing out on mass, and that's a really important part. And it's the same thing I think with, like fortitude, like you were saying. Yeah, you should have fortitude. You should be courageous. You should push yourself and strive to to be the best, like be what God created you to be courageously. But you also have to like you got to be smart about it. So I used to I don't know if you can tell or not. I'm not a super big guy. I work out regularly, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not a big beefy dude. So
Yeah.
but I used to be really into road cycling, right? Um
Okay.
and in road cycling it's the same kind of thing. And I think that you can have this in any instance where like, if you push way too hard on the bike one day, well, you're supposed to train 4 or 5 days a week. If you go really really hard on Monday, you're not going to be able to like go again on Wednesday, or that workout Wednesday is going to really suffer. And it's the same thing, you got to you got to pace yourself a little bit. um
Definitely.
so
Definitely.
and
So I think again, there's that missing piece. I love that there's more Catholic men who are even talking about virtue. That
mm,
we're saying, hey, you actually need to make yourself strong, right? Especially us married men,
yeah.
especially. I think it's written in us as men, period, but especially married men, where you now are living the office of priest of your home and are called to serve, protect, and defend your family. There's a natural virtue in saying, I need to be pretty physically equipped to live
Mhm.
those duties well, right? So I think that's a gift. I think it's even more beautiful when you see that in light of all of the cardinal virtues, and even bigger in light of your nature, right? As St. Thomas describes it, as a body soul composite, and looking at which aspects of us are primarily wounded, right? Because we can sit all day long in fortitude and do all those courageous things as it relates to my physical health. But do you do that courageous thing to talk to your wife when it's kind of awkward, or you might be
Yeah.
vulnerable, or you might risk humiliation? Are we looking at it that way? Right? It's so much deeper. And what I really want to do is I want to kind of help the listeners start to take a deeper dive into what virtue actually is, because I really think, especially me as a counselor and coach, right, it really is the answer, the long-term solution towards not only healing, integration, but also growth towards excellence, right? And so revitalizing virtue in its fullness is, I think, what is absolutely necessary for the church to kind of get back on track, right? We kind of lost our way, right? To really get back on track, especially for us as men, right? So it's a huge passion of mine. It's at the root of what we do at Serviam Institute.
Man, that's good. So you mentioned like the body soul composite, and this is
Yeah.
something that I grew up a Protestant. Um
Mhm.
and I was extremely grateful for my time as a Protestant. I'm super glad to be Catholic now. But,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
I would never look back and say, "Man, I wish I wasn't a Protestant." I came down the path that I came down, and I'm glad that I am where I am now. But
Yeah.
so one of the things that really, I mean, it was true within Protestantism as well, but I didn't really feel it until I came into the Catholic Church fully, was like that connection, that body soul composite connection, like you were talking about. That's such a big deal. I mean, if you look at it from the seven sacraments of the church, they all are like real physical, tangible signs. So baptism is the most obvious that I think
Mhm.
everyone knows of, but like you use physical water over your head, um,
Mhm.
or your entire body, I guess, depending on,
Right.
it varies a little bit, but there's
Yeah.
real physical water. There's real physical things that are being done to you, but it's changing your soul as well. Um,
Right.
and I think that these when you have these virtues that you're growing in, and when they're rightly ordered, and you kind of growing in each of the four cardinal virtues, it helps not only your soul but also like physical, y- like you were
Yep.
saying, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your kids, if you're not married, with kids, your relationship with your friends, um,
Mhm.
or your family. This All of these things are intertwined, and I think that, I mean, you feel free to expound on it more, but I think that's why this
Yeah.
is so important.
Yeah, well, it's we are a body soul composite, and as you're mentioning with the sacraments, right? There is a matter and there's a form to
Hmm.
the sacraments, which makes it valid, based on my understanding. Again,
Yeah, yeah.
so same thing is true for us, right? There we have as body soul composite. There is the matter, and then there's the form, right? The soul being the form, right, and the body being the matter, right? Without the form, without the soul, we are dead, right? A body without a soul is a corpse, right? And so for us, we were made, right, in an integrated fashion as a composite being, right? This is the travesty of modern day psychology, is they don't recognize the soul, right? And even if they do, it's like some kind of new agey, lofty idea of what the spirit could be, something that's just whatever you feel like. No, it's really not that, right? You have a soul, you have one soul, right? And it animates the body. And there are certain faculties, as St. Thomas calls it. We can look at that as like a part, for lack of a better term, maybe a power. Um, Faculties that reside only in the soul. And then there's faculties that reside within the body as a body soul composite faculty. So, as an example, our intellect and our will are faculties that are strictly immaterial. And we know that they're immaterial because they understand universal principles that we couldn't possibly experience in our particular lives, right? Like, for example, I know universally that a right triangle, right, is three sides and has a right angle, right? We know that, but I've never encountered every right triangle on planet Earth. It's impossible, right? How do I know a universal truth transcends my own personal experience? Well, that's because immaterial, your intellect can grasp the essence of what a right triangle is, right? That goes beyond whether or not I've looked at every right triangle on planet Earth or not. It transcends the particular experience, right? Same thing with our will. We know our will must be immaterial because God made it free, right? And if it was bound by the material realm, it wouldn't be truly free, right? And so our intellect and our will are immaterial, but we also have faculties that are within the body soul composite that operate through a bodily organ, right? Like our emotions. St. Thomas called them passions, right? I mentioned the concupiscible and the irascible appetite, basically your desires and your drive, right? There are certain emotions that are moved by these appetites, right? So, for example, he calls hope an emotion, right? Same thing is true with a desire for something, sorrow, fear. These are emotions that St. Thomas talks about. You feel those physically, right? We have an emotion center in the brain, right? You can look at where the activity of an emotion is highlighted, right? The amygdala, right? We also have your memory, right? I can find your memory center in the brain, right? There also your imagination. You can see activity in your imagination. If I took a brain scan, you can see what parts of your brain is active, right? Obviously, we talk about our organs, our flesh. There are things that St. Thomas describes that are beyond immaterial. They're also material, right? It is paramount that the lower faculties, those that again operate through a bodily organ, serve the higher faculties, are subordinate to the higher faculties. How can you do that in modern psychology and assist someone in doing that if you don't even recognize the soul to begin with? Basically, you don't even recognize the higher faculties, right? So, at best, you're helping clean up some of the mess in the lower faculties, like your emotions getting out of whack and your memories that are constantly tripping you up and your imagination that is going every which way. At best, you might help kind of buffer, the trigger, so to speak, or the environmental motivators. At worst, you're just solidifying the need that the lower faculties are in charge, which, according to St. Thomas, is the exact inversion of how we were made. Our higher faculties are in charge, right? Our emotions, our memory, our imagination, the associations we make about things in life, those are all good insofar as they are subordinate to the intellect, which is ordered towards truth, knowing what is actually true, and the will, which is ordered towards the good, the universal good, right? Truth is obviously, and goodness is obviously a person, right? That's God Himself, right? It's ultimately ordered towards Him, right? So again, going back to like what I do in Thomistic psychology, modern psychology is really missing the person, and I think this is why a lot of Catholics scoff at counseling psychology because they're like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, or it's just a bunch of like new age stuff, or you just sit on the couch and vent all day. And what I really want to do is revitalize what authentic psychology is. And that's going back to St. Thomas, right? St. Thomas made it very clear what mental health is and what mental illness is. Right? He basically said, here are your parts of your nature, your faculties. Here's what they're capable of. This is how they interact with each other, right? And this is what they're supposed to be doing, right? In order to live in accordance with the Creator, God Himself, right? Mental health, or my role as a counselor and even a coach, is to bring order to those faculties, not based off of what makes the counsel or the client feel better, not what makes them feel heard, although that's good in and of itself sometimes, but it's more so what helps them reintegrate based off of the design from the creator, based off of their nature. It's reordering, right? I describe it sometimes as I'm like a mechanic, so to speak, right? I pop open the hood, I say, here are the parts of your vehicle, and this is what this part does, and this is what this part does, this is how it was made, and this is what the intended use is, and this is how they interact with each other. Well, because of wear and tear, and because of maybe weather conditions, and maybe because of poor maintenance, right? Things can be damaged. There could be issues. And what happens? It can start to impact the functioning of another part of underneath the hood. It can even impact the overall optimal function of the vehicle, right? Even to the point where it's dangerous to drive in that vehicle, given the damage. In a similar way, St. Thomas says, here's your faculties. And they were meant to do a certain thing in a rightly ordered way, and they were meant to interact with each other in a certain way. Well, in similar fashion, just like I gave you with the car example, because of our family of origin, because of our traumatic experiences, because of our own bad habits and proclivity to sin, because of our temperament, our own disposition, right? What happens? Those faculties can get damaged and disordered. And that's why people come to me and they're saying, Keoni, there's something wrong. I'm lashing out too much. I'm so fearful and anxious, or I can't get myself to do that next thing. Well, what I do is I pop open the hood and I say, okay, let's look at which faculty is primarily wounded. Although there's probably all of them are wounded to some extent because we're so intimately connected, right? What is the root one? And then there's a virtue that can reorder that. And that's where the conversation comes is now let's cultivate that particular virtue in that way. And I'm going to assist you in building that regularly. At the same time, eradicating that vice that has been the product, the result of that traumatic experience, that family of origin issue, whatever the case is, so that we're reordering you and your engine, so to speak, is operating as efficiently as possible, the way the manufacturer, in this case, God himself, designed you. Right? I hope that made sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And you brought up a interesting point that so talking about vice and virtue, because
Mhm.
I think is it correct that for every virtue there's an opposite vice, right?
Mhm.
Okay,
Yep.
so uh recently so I teach OCIA at my local parish
Yeah.
and recently we had my priest come in and he did a teach. I was thinking, man, like who's the best person that I could get to talk about confession? And I was like, I know the guy who does it all the time, right? Like
Seriously.
this he would be a great person. So one of the things that he brought up was that point that like, you know, if you just try to run from vice or you just try to say, hey, here's the bad things that I'm doing, I just want to stop, right? If you're not moving in the opposite direction, then it's not going to do you any good. It's like the uh or the this I can't remember the saying, but basically like if there's an empty house, well, there's a story in the Bible about, the lady cleaned out her house and it was perfectly clean, and then Satan came back in and like destroyed it again, right? Because it wasn't
Mhm.
filled with anything good.
Right.
And so when you were talking about vices, this I like that made it that clicked in my brain because I was thinking, yeah, you
Yeah.
can't just go stop doing the bad thing. Just don't do the bad thing. It's like no, you get yeah, that's
Yep.
part of it, but you're missing the other part of moving towards the virtue that
Right.
corresponds to that.
Well, that's what trips a lot of people up, right?
Mm.
Especially with you think about something like lust, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're just like stop, 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 don't do it, run from it, run from it. It's like almost like an obsessiveness, right? And I think of it this way: if I was addicted to McDonald's, and it was just so easy and convenient, and it was a part of my childhood, and that's what my family gave me, and I just got so used to it, and it tastes really good, and it's pretty cheap, right? And then you just had this struggle, but then you get an epiphany, right? This is like not good for me. It's junk food. It's ruining my health. It's tanking my energy. It's you name it, right? They get this
Mhm.
intellectual conviction. If all they did every day was say, don't go to McDonald's, don't avoid McDonald's, you can't, don't turn left, McDonald's is down the road, don't go to McDonald's, they probably would avoid it every once in a while, but not enough. Why? Because you don't even know where to go from there,
Mhm.
right? And what I often tell people, whenever this type of situation comes, is it's a whole lot better to be on the fast food diet than to starve to death.
Yeah.
And in that moment, when you say there's nothing, just avoid, 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 avoid. Well, that's all I've known. That's how I fed myself.
Mm.
So when you're saying avoid, 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 you're saying avoid feeding yourself. And naturally, we go into self preservation mode, and I'd rather eat fast food than
Yeah.
die of starvation. The better response is yes, avoid the vice in certain ways, avoid the near occasion, right? We say this in every act of contrition, right? But it's also what are you going to pursue? Right.
Mm.
What if you learned so and so down the road, or my uncle, or that one YouTuber is actually really, really well versed in the whole food diet, the animal based diet, the whatever keto diet? And I'm like, I'm learning meals. And wow, that's actually pretty reasonable as far as cost and time. And this tastes really good. I didn't know that this type of food can taste good. And wow, my energy is starting to improve. All of a sudden, they're cultivating the virtue, right? They're learning how to have a better relationship, a more rightly ordered relationship with food. Then, whenever they pass that McDonald's, they might have an initial kind of inclination, like, oh man, those fries sound good. But now they have the virtue to turn to, but I know where I'm
Mm.
going. I know what I'm doing. I know the benefits of that virtue. So I'm not going to settle for that fraudulent version of it,
Mm,
right? But if all you say is avoid the fraud, avoid the fraud, avoid the fraud, well, it seems so real to you for so long, it's insufficient. At best, it becomes virtue in the absence of vice, right? Where you get rid of access to it and it looks virtuous. I haven't been to McDonald's in 2 months. The minute I let you go back in there, you pig out on it, right?
right.
You didn't actually cultivate the virtue, it's deceptive, right? So I think, again, knowing the relationship between virtue and vice and how they're actually intimately connected and identifying the vice is not enough, right? Pursuing that opposite virtue, that not only leads to a quicker change in virtue, right? Kind of like momentum, a lot
Yeah.
faster. We often get stuck just trying to avoid the vice, but it often leads to a more long lasting change because the work you've built to avoid the vice was met with the same intensity towards cultivating the opposite virtue, right? And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a firm disposition to do the good. Firm means it's not going to just kind of go away tomorrow,
Right.
right? And of course, you need to build it to be even more firm over time to the point where it's almost unchanging,
Yeah.
unchangeable, right? But that's really the whole point of it, right? So I think what Father said, for you is right on, especially with the work that I do, right? And again, we don't
Yeah.
even know what vices and virtues really are, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because like well, and just, thinking about the lower faculties and all these emotions
Yeah,
and the things that you experience and like well, because we're body soul composites, these physical like desires that you feel like especially with lust, right? Like, oh, I'm physically drawn to this thing or this,
yeah,
those things aren't going away. They don't disappear. They are there and they're a gift from God. And I think that one thing in multiple areas of life that's helped me is understanding like okay, these desires and these wants and these emotions and the things that you're feeling are not bad, but you gotta get them ordered rightly. Like you can use them for good. You don't want them to disappear. They are a gift from God, but they can get out like with everything else. They can get out of whack. Um, but and there's something deeper. Like that emotion that you're feeling, there's something deeper there. Like you were talking about with the car example. So, and this kind of well, you talk about Thomistic psychology, and I have couple of buddies who they're in psychology, they're psychologists, um, and they were thinking, man, Thomistic psychology, that's interesting. And you've mentioned it a little bit, but that kind of distinction between modern day psychology and Thomistic psychology, so I've seen therapists before. In the past, it's not nearly as bad now, but I've been a wildly anxious person and I could
mm,
never figure it out. And I always kind of got that feeling like you were talking about. They're just trying to fix, like, just don't make him anxious. Like, just make the anxiety go away. They never really wanted to go much deeper than that. It was just the bad thing he's feeling. He's feeling this bad emotion. What do we need to do to get this bad emotion to go away? Like, how can we make him happy? And they gave me some things that were helpful, but I was just thinking, and none of this is like tangible. It all just seems like superficial. So the example that I think of is, if you have a car where your tire is wearing down really bad on one side, it sounds like the modern psychology, like modern day psychology that a lot of people, including myself, tend to make fun of is like taking the car to the mechanic and going, "Hey, let's jack the car up and we'll just change your tire for you real quick. Like we'll just your tire is worn on the left side really bad, so you just need a new tire." And it's like, yeah, sure, that fixes it for a little bit, but it's gonna get worn on the left side again before too long. Whereas it sounds like Thomistic psychology kind of goes, okay, your tire's wearing on the left side really, really bad. There's a reason for that. Like it's not
right.
it's supposed to evenly wear and it's not
Mhm.
evenly wearing. So like let's look a little bit deeper into this. I mean, would that be the difference
Well,
between the two?
absolutely. I think that's a great analogy because then you can look at it. Is it your driving habits, right?
Yeah.
Or is it something as it relates to the terrain? It's not even your habits, it's just like where you tend to drive, right? It could be, so that'd be more environment. The other one be more in your actions, right? But also, is it a defect in the manufacturing? It just has a proclivity given the way it was designed and no one even caught it, maybe kind of going out the gate, right? I think for us going into the psychological piece, so those I work with, like most people, right, they struggle with anxiety, especially in the modern day when we're overly stimulated and everybody's on social media and comparing themselves to everybody else, right? It's a pretty anxious ridden world.
Yeah.
Um, it could be easy to say, okay, this person is constantly in fight or flight. I need to help him put out the fire. And if he can learn to, like, in some level of proficiency, put out those fires, then hey, high five, you're ready to go. I
Yeah.
think that is, I mean, that is so superficial, right? Because imagine this. I look at your symptoms and I say, okay, yeah, you're prone to fear. Well, that's a passion. That's an emotion, right? We can tend to go towards the negative. Okay. How much of that is related to your temperament? Meaning your natural inclinations, the way your matter, St. Thomas says, is kind of formulated, right? You're just kind of born being a little bit more pessimistic, right? Maybe you're born kind of overthinking, right? Well, what's the gift in that? You're probably prone to meditation. You're probably prone to analyze well. That's a gift when moderated. But if we never really recognize that as a gift or a potential vice, we kind of just let it happen. And then when a trigger comes, something unexpected, right? We do what we know. So we're going to overthink. We're going to react to that spike. And then it becomes a vice. Why? Because we keep reacting the same way, right? And then what's worse is we develop associations based off of that. I remember last time this happened, right? It didn't work out well.
Yeah.
And so it's going to happen again. There's an association, it's learned, right? In modern psychology, we would say that's a neural pathway that was formed. St. Thomas basically calls it your cogitative power, which is a faculty in the lower faculties. It makes an association. It says this is like this. It takes the image in your imagination based off of what you're experiencing in the moment and saying that image is very similar to this in your memory. And this is just like this. So you should feel either good about it, this is a good thing, or it's harmful or even evil, right? That's your cogitative power. It can be radically helpful when it's ordered. It could be incredibly debilitating when it's disordered, like in trauma, right? When my wife tells me that she's not super happy with the way I've been interacting with the kids, but I go back to, hey, remember when your mom used to criticize you? And she would
Mm.
yell at you. And she criticized you as like her son. And oh,
Mm.
your cogitative power, if we don't check it, will say, hey, she's criticizing you just like mom. She's like knocking your whole identity. And then you get really defensive in that moment. Then you start to yell. And then we don't even recognize it. We're reacting to something that's irrelevant to reality. Because again, reality is in the intellect, right? Understanding truth, right? What is. And so modern psychology it's stuck in the lower faculties, right? And so by nature, it's disordered
Mm.
because it should be lower faculties in service of your higher faculties,
Yeah.
right? Because when that anxiousness is harnessed, right, it becomes a drive to do what is good, a drive um, to move towards some sort of
Mm.
excellence, right? Because usually anxious people have an ideal of something, right? A perfection in mind, right? Well, that's a gift, right? Because if you didn't have that, you'd be super complacent and lazy, right? But it's in
Right.
tempering it and saying, okay, out of prudence, the intellect is able to say, this is the excellence you're seeking. Let's humble ourselves and focus on the next step towards that long-term goal.
Mm.
Notice how we're still working towards the perfection. It's just now your process is oriented towards reality,
Yeah.
not what your emotions are telling you is absolutely critical and necessary, right now. And then even what your memory might be pulling up, right? Your cogitative power might be pulling up those memories that are maybe even outdated or irrelevant to the here and now. So looking at the complete picture and how all your faculties are working together, body, soul, right, is way more transforming because you're getting to the roots of things. And then you cultivate that virtue that really helps heal long term, right, to where you don't even really struggle with that anymore. You might be tempted towards it. If you kind of let your foot off the gas, you might be inclined towards it. But as you continue to cultivate the virtues, it's almost like a thing that you don't really struggle with anymore. It's like that person who's been on the animal-based diet for a year. They drive past the McDonald's like, man, yeah, I used to, but I don't have that craving anymore. It actually kind of makes me
Mm.
feel a little sick just thinking about those fries, right? That's a similar thing with virtue and vice, right? Is I used to fall into that vice of, overthinking, right? Lacking custody of the mind, or presumption, or fear, right? But, I've really worked on surrendering. I've really worked on humility. I've
Mm.
really worked on trust and courage, risking that unknown and being like, hey, at the end of the day, the Lord will provide. It's in seeing in the bigger picture that, man, you really start to see so much more healing and growth and long lasting growth rather than what we often tend to experience, right? Is, hey, you learn some tools to put out that fire for the next couple weeks, you know?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I hope that
yeah.
makes
Good
sense.
luck. Yeah, here's the water hose. Good luck. It's
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
And one of the when you were talking, part of what I was thinking through too is I really like how this Thomistic psychology is very. I've seen some more like Christian, just generic Christian therapists before, and in talking to them, you kind of get like, well, Jesus loves you and God's got your back, kind of, which is all good and true, but like
Right.
if you're someone if you have these really big issues, it's like, okay, I get that, but how do I I need something more tangible. Like, how break this down for me further. And I really like how it sounds like in Thomistic psychology, all of these sciences of like psychology, like you have parts of your brain that will light up, when you imagine things, or like when you're sad, this part of your brain's gonna, like, I can see it in brain scans and things like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
I really like how it seems like this doesn't deny the more scientific, studies of psychology that have been done for years and years and years, but it also doesn't, like you're saying, it doesn't ignore the soul either. And this seems like a really good marrying of the two. Like, both of these are really important. Yeah, all the data and the science and the brain scans and everything else, all of this is really important, but you can't forget the soul. And when you bring those two things together, that's when you have like something really good that can help you move forward and move more fully towards like what you were created to be.
Hmm.
um,
Exactly. Any modern psychology counseling approach, even coaching, kind of personal development approach that leads to any healing long term, longer than like a couple weeks, right? Any long term healing has some root in Thomistic psychology.
hmm.
You can trace the reason why it's working to Thomistic psychology. Why? Because St. Thomas described our nature as a human person. So if it's helping us in some way reorder what is disordered or distorted in our nature, well, then it's Thomistic, right? Without maybe even knowing it, right? They might use different language, they might have used a different approach, right? But at the root of it, like you think about with trauma, what do they often talk about? Well, they talk about separating the emotion from that event. So you can look at it and say objectively, that was terrible what happened to me, but it's not something that elicits an instinctual, dramatic, and maybe even disproportionate, given the time now, emotion, right? I've learned to separate it, right? St. Thomas called that disassociation, right? Not like what we call like I dissociated, right? Like not
Right,
even
right.
present. But he said we disassociated the emotion from the event, right? And that's what healing is, right? So a lot of the work that they do is they basically help people ground, like grounding exercises. I know a lot of modern psychology, they use the term mindfulness, which isn't Catholic, right? The basic understanding of that is in it, I call it like a focused awareness, right? Really what you're doing is you're basing it off of a Thomistic principle. That is, your emotions are moved by the presence of its object, the object either being in your sensual experience and or in your imagination. So what happens is that situation happened, right? That person said something. Immediately that reminds me of what that perpetrator or that one negative situation, that car accident, right? Whatever the case is, it brings it into my imagination right then and there, right? Instinctively. And then the emotion that was tied to that memory is elicited by nature, right? And that's the trauma response, right? So what's the whole point? Well, it starts in the imagination. You have to learn to redirect what is in the imagination because your emotions are blind faculties. They have to be told what to do and where to go, right? And how to move. They don't just move on their own. They're moved by something, St. Thomas says, because it's an appetite. You have to present it with something to either want it or not want it, right? So we have to learn to change what's in the imagination, so we can turn off the alarm, so to speak. And then true healing is in the intellect, healing that association. Your intellect is actually able to say, hey, I know, like, in that particular experience that was terrible and that person, you cannot be trusted, but like that person doesn't exist in your life anymore. And this is actually your husband. It's not your father or your uncle,
Mm.
right? And so your intellect is seeing the bigger picture and saying, even you bring it in even deeper in light of Christ, in light of what we know is true about our faith, universal truth, you bring it into that memory and that association, transform the image that is kind of prepackaged, right? Because of our experiences. And what happens? By nature, your emotions have to change. New
Yeah.
image, new emotion, right? But if you don't understand, again, how the parts work underneath the hood, you're kind of
Yeah.
guessing and you're hoping. But again, you can even see in modern psychology any of the of these approaches that have some long-term healing, which is there are some that do, right?
Yeah.
You can see why it's working in light of what St. Thomas said about the human person,
Huh.
right? So yeah, to your point, it doesn't. They do not disagree with each other when it comes to modern science and Thomistic psychology. Modern science just confirms what St. Thomas said, and more often than not, when it comes to Thomistic psychology, right?
Yeah.
Which is just beautiful, right? And it makes me even more
Yeah.
passionate about revitalizing this approach in the mental health space, in the personal development space.
Yeah. Nice. That's interesting. So you mentioned a couple times about like nature and
Yeah, yeah,
temperament. So are those two
yeah,
things would those two things be the same thing? And like why should I care about what my temperament is in the first place? Like what kind of
yeah,
value can that bring?
yeah. So I would say, and again, I have to confirm this, but I would say your temperament is an aspect of your nature. It's not your
Okay.
nature itself, right?
Okay.
So we have our nature is a body and soul,
Mhm.
right? And within that are those faculties that I told you. We all have an intellect and a will, right? Memory, etc., emotions. That's a part of our nature. Your temperament is basically the way your matter is formulated, right? So what that means is you're basically disposed or inclined towards certain things, and there's other things you're not inclined towards, right? We see this very clearly in marriages. I'm sort of like this person. I'm a little bit more extroverted. The other person is more introverted. I'm a little bit more outgoing. The other one's more quiet and reserved. I'm inclined towards these things, and my spouse is inclined towards something very different. Temperaments are essential because you need to understand what you're drawn to without even thinking. If you don't understand that, well, here's the issue. You've been reacting to those inclinations from the moment it's probably you were born, but at least let's just say the age of reason. You were
Yeah.
just kind of reacting to them blindly. And what happened? Well, those we all have disordered inclinations.
Mhm.
Those became vices. And now because you never even understood what you're inclined towards and why, right? Now you have to combat these vices that are really difficult now to overcome because it's a firm disposition at this point, right? So, in those who work with me, that's one of the first things I have them understand. I say it's know thyself 101. It's basically here's an introduction into you, your tendencies and your inclinations. Now, with my assessment, there's a virtue and vice assessment. So, it's like an updated version of not
Mhm.
only your basic inclinations, but it's also your virtues and vices, which are intimately connected, right? But your inclinations don't always equal vice or
Mhm.
virtue, right? It's just what you're inclined towards, right? The virtue and vice is the decision you make in response to that inclination, right? But man, it's so healing. Again, let's go back to the context of marriage to recognize when my spouse wants to just kind of move on because we just had an argument and she's like ready to have like the best day ever tomorrow. And I'm over here like, I'm not done. Like we have
Yeah.
plenty of more to talk about. Well, what's the issue here? Well, I'm more inclined to overthink. I'm more inclined towards the ideal. And if I don't see that that ideal has been met, I harbor on it and I'm more prone to resentment. My wife is more optimistic, more kind of quick emotions. She's a little bit more inclined towards impulsivity, more benefit of the doubt. She's naturally more agreeable. So I might take it personally. Like she doesn't want to heal. She doesn't take this seriously. And I'm like, it has nothing to do with that, man. It's not even personal,
Yeah.
right? She naturally can kind of overlook something and not think too deeply about it. And the next day, there's new, stimuli, there's new situations. She's ready for it. There's a gift there because she probably doesn't harbor a lot of resentment. She's probably able to kind of get over things where I might struggle with that. But on the contrary, there's a gift in what my tendency might be to want to seek justice, to not avoid it just because it might be difficult, to come to a long term solution, because that's where real healing is. But if we can leverage our tendencies as battle partners towards the same unified goal, we are a pretty powerful team. But
Yeah.
most couples, they don't even know the tendencies, so they're too busy reacting to them and taking them personal. And now we're creating more of a mess than we had regarding the whatever the situation was, whatever the problem was, right? We added
Yeah.
more issues to the table. Why do we need to do that? Right? But it's essential that we know ourselves and we know our spouse's temperament. And I would even argue knowing your child's temperament, your children's temperaments.
Mm.
So you understand what helps them grow in virtue based off of their inclinations, right? Again, it's know thyself 101. If you want to cultivate the virtues and eradicate vices, it's probably pretty useful to know which vices come pretty easily to you, what you're inclined towards, and what virtues are you more likely equipped to demonstrate and to practice just by nature of your temperament. They come naturally to you, and which virtues struggle you struggle
Yeah.
to cultivate, right? That is like, you know, it would be silly to not have that as a foundational aspect of growth and healing.
Yeah.
So I hope that
Yeah.
answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's, like with so many other things, sometimes you can have this knee jerk reaction to say, oh, this XYZ thing is bad. So I need to just get rid of it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, not necessarily, like you're talking about in these instances where maybe one of the spouses just gets over things wildly quickly and the other one
Yeah.
just wants to wants to be angry for, like, no, there's something wrong here. Neither of those things are in and of themselves bad or need to get, you don't necessarily need to just throw those things out, but if you
Right.
rightly order those things, like God made you the way that you are on purpose. He didn't,
Right.
the way that you think,
Right.
your tendencies, the things that you're inclined towards, those are gifts from God. But it's our job to say, okay, how do I take these things that I like truly really feel, and how do I rightly order them? Um,
Right.
and I,
That's your pathway to holiness is knowing
yeah,
your temperament. Here's
right,
basically, it's almost like you know, to use like a video game example, right? You're given a character and they can't have like full bars on every attribute, right? Because that'd just
right.
be cheating, right? But you can pick which one you want. Some are a little bit stronger, some are a little bit faster, some think a little bit quicker. You pick yours.
Yeah.
You still have to cultivate those weaknesses, right? Towards virtue, right? And you
Mhm.
must leverage those good strengths in the rightly ordered way. But the goal is
Mhm.
perfection. And in that sense, we can really learn from someone who has a different temperament, especially in the context of marriage. You want your battle partner to have a different blind spot than you have. Because if you both have the same blind spot, all it takes is the enemy to find it and you're both screwed, right? Whereas if we have different blind spots, different
Yeah.
strengths, man, that is a huge asset because even if the enemy looks and exposes it, my battle partner is right there, ready and willing to defend against me. How beautiful is that when you understand it, right?
Mhm.
But we often take the differences personally because we don't understand our nature, right? And it's a travesty, right? We're wasting so much time, energy, and emotion reacting to these things when they're actually huge gifts towards our healing, right? And the strengthening of our marriage, right?
Mhm.
Not only for our sake, right? And not only just for our children's sake, which is huge in and of itself, but ultimately to glorify God as we should, living this vocation with excellence, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, man, this has been great. I feel like we covered a lot in a short period of time, and I feel like I have a million more questions for you. So
I'm
that means
sure. I'm
I
sure.
gotta have you back on again, is what that means. But
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
yeah, well, one more time, if you want to tell people how to find you, how to reach you, let them know.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can find me at serviuminstitute.com on Instagram at the Virtue Coach. I am starting a new cohort of men
Mm.
who want to grow in virtue, starting my 12-week virtue building program. and men who are serious about it. It's going to be starting here in the next couple weeks, Thursdays at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I'm looking for 10 to 15 men who are like, they're motivated. Maybe they're inspired by this. Like, hey, Keoni's not about that venting and new age stuff. He seems like he actually knows what he's talking about. And I want to grow in virtue. You kind of sold me on this path of excellence. Well, I created a 12-week virtue building program that systematically helps you grow in those virtues in light of our nature, right? With that Thomistic foundation. It comes with homework assignments. It comes with a pre and post assessment so we can monitor and look at our growth over time. And I really love the idea of doing it with a group of men because we can learn from each other. We recognize that our experiences, although they could be unique in certain ways, we can relate to each other in so many other ways. And so that fraternity is always been such a gift. And there's homework assignments that we can learn from each other on and discuss. So it's such a beautiful thing. So if people are interested in that, they can submit a contact form on Serviam Institute, or they can email me directly, keoni@serviaminstitute.com. For those who are wanting individual services, coaching and or counseling, depending on where you're located, they can reach me at keoni@serviaminstitute as well.
Okay. Awesome. Well, cool. Well,
Perfect.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being on.
Thank you so much. It was such a blast, and I'm looking forward to the next round.
Yeah, absolutely.